Hey guys, the Father's Most Excellent here again, and thanks for tuning into another video. And in this one I've actually decided I'm going to keep it more casual and go easy on the editing process so that I can hopefully stay more focused on my main project and eventually finish it. That is the Gnosticism video that I've been working on for literal years now. Because part of the reason it's taking so long is that I have to just keep stopping over and over to work on smaller videos so that the channel won't totally stagnate. Because what's the point of making this epic video about Gnosticism if, when I come back to post it, I've essentially lost the majority of my audience, you know? And so, hopefully this kind of format, which is much less intensive when it comes to editing, will help me be more productive in that regard. And maybe even drop more videos more often. And you guys let me know in the comments what you think about this kind of format. Would you prefer I put more editing into the videos and produce less overall like I normally do? Or keep it light on the editing and put that extra effort into my bigger project? So go ahead and voice your opinion below, but today actually I want to talk about the Freemason Albert Pike and actually demonstrate that he was a Luciferian in spite of what you will hear from Masonic apologists. And for example, many of you are probably familiar with this quotation from Pike on the screen where he claims that the upper echelon of Masonry is Luciferian. But this quote is disputed by Masons, and it's basically taken as gospel truth by them that it's a hoax, because they'll say it's what's known as the Taxil hoax, where the man who first put this quote to print, Leo Taxil, supposedly and genuinely confessed to forging the quotation to trick everyone. Now, I want you to know that I personally reject this whole narrative about the Taxil hoax, and I myself still hold the quote to be genuine after looking into that issue in some depth. And so that's why you'll still see it appear in some of my videos. It's not because I'm trying to trick people with a fake quote, but because I reject the claim of hoax, though I do recognize that it's disputed. But the purpose of this video isn't to refute the Taxil hoax, though I will say briefly that the public confession offered as proof by those claiming hoax has some serious holes in it. And to be clear, I'm not denying that Taxil quote-unquote confessed. Rather, I'm just denying that his confession was genuine. I mean, just saying, there's ways to force a false confession out of people, you know? And if you know anything about the dark past of Masonry, where they literally had people like William Morgan murdered to keep their secrets, which is a matter of historical fact. Go read the history behind William Morgan and what happened to him. So, with that kind of thing in mind, the idea of a forced confession doesn't really sound all that crazy. But that said, if one looks at the publicly available confession where Taxil confessed to the press and the Catholic Church of his day, there's obviously some funny business going on, to say the least. Because firstly, the whole confession was supposedly recorded by a single individual present for the event in full spontaneity. That is, they supposedly wrote it as the crowd, the press, and Taxil himself just went back and forth with each other. And it's a massive undertaking if that's true, because it runs to more than 13,000 words, and you can see on the screen an example of the constant back and forth that goes on in the confession, which even for a modern stenographer with all the technical advances that we have, this would be pretty difficult to keep up with the constant back and forth and try to keep it all straight who said what in what order. So the idea of these 13,000 plus words being recorded in their full moment-by-moment spontaneity like that is pretty absurd. And so I think this write-up borders on a fictional novel. I mean, even the way it's recorded for public consumption is like an amateur playwright would compose his propaganda. I mean, tell me if you think that this back-and-forth banter that took place in a public place is actually genuinely believable. Because this just isn't the way real people in the real world speak in public dialogue, not even back then. Instead, this is the way performers in a play speak, that is over-the-top dramatic. So I think it's pretty clear that the record of the public confession is highly suspicious, and that's just the beginning of the issues. But these are the kinds of things that lead me to believe that the whole confession was nothing more but a well-crafted cover story that was meant to deal with the embarrassment that Masonry faced when Pike's letter giving instructions to the 23 Supreme Councils of the world fell into the hands of the public. Because for 20 long years after the Pike quote surfaced, Masonry was facing tremendous backlash and falling numbers due to one of their most prestigious members being labeled a Satanist because of this nefarious quote. And then, wouldn't you know it, coincidentally out of nowhere, Taxil just suddenly announces that he just concocted the whole thing as some elaborate prank that fooled everyone and that the letter could just be disregarded. And then Taxil himself would go on to be considered a lying scoundrel for the rest of his life, just totally destroying his reputation. And so, in the end, the confession really only benefited one group of people. That is, the Masons, who now had the perfect excuse to dismiss anyone who brought up Pike's Lucifer quote, which is exactly what happens now. because anytime anyone mentions the quote, or even other quotes by Pike that mention Lucifer, Masons dismiss them immediately and begin accusing those using it of being deceitful. Well, if that was the only quote we had from Pike implying that he believed Luciferian doctrine, then I probably wouldn't be so hesitant to accept the claimed hoax. But the truth is that this quotation from Pike authenticates itself when we set it against his other known beliefs and writings, and other similar quotations from his like-minded peers even. And so now I actually want to talk about the infamous Lucifer quote from Pike found in his undisputed work, Morals and Dogma. Which, don't get me wrong, when I say it's undisputed, I mean no one disputes that Pike wrote it. But the meaning of the quote is definitely highly disputed by Masons, because they'll want to portray it as though Pike isn't actually saying anything positive about Lucifer, he's just making a passing statement that we shouldn't read too much into. But when we carefully examine the quote, you're going to see that it's totally consistent with Pike's words found in the Taxil hoax quote. And so firstly, note how Pike capitalizes the word light in the third sentence here. And you can see that's not my alteration, but it appears in the original text that way. This actually shows that Pike is speaking about the light of Masonry, as he and many other Masonic authors call it, because they teach Masonry as a searching after and a bequeathing of light, that is, enlightenment or illumination about divine truth. And it's all through the pages of Morals and Dogma, and this is how Pike always refers to it, that is, by capitalizing the first letter of the word. So Pike is saying here that Lucifer the light bearer is actually bearing the very light, capital L, of Masonry itself. And so that's why he also speaks of this light that Lucifer bears as being splendorous, that is, grand or magnificent. And when you think about it, you don't call the light of a being you think is evil splendorous. That's like what you call the light of God or something, because splendor is a good, positive quality. So this clearly shows Pike is looking at Lucifer in a positive way here in the quote. And even further, notice how he begins the quote by seemingly arguing that Lucifer can't be an evil being of darkness because he's called Lucifer, which means light bearer. And so in other words, his argument is that Lucifer can't be evil with a name like that. It's like he's saying, well, that's a strange name for God to give to someone in the Bible if he thinks he's a bad guy. So he's clearly trying to undermine the biblical and Christian view that Lucifer is a being of darkness, since their own Bible calls him Lucifer. Though technically Pike's uninformed in the matter here, since Lucifer is just a much later Latin translation of the original word Hallel, which Hallel just means brazen or shining one, not light bearer, as I cover in my Is Lucifer Satan video. Light bearer comes off as much more positive because it's like he's bearing forth the light of God, but rather the word Hallel is actually just portraying Lucifer as shiny, not bearing any light, quote unquote. Because remember, Pike is trying to focus in on that word light and associate it with the light of Masonry. Well, if you go back to the original Hebrew, he can't make that connection because it's just he's a shiny or brazen one. And I mean, Paul in the New Testament specifically says Satan only disguises himself as an angel of light, meaning in reality, he's an evil being of darkness underneath that disguise. Just like his evil workers who present themselves as good, but are wolves in sheep's clothing. But Pike is obviously trying to avoid that kind of conclusion here of portraying Lucifer as dark or evil, which isn't something you do if you're thinking of him in a negative way like Masons want to claim is Pike's view in this passage. But lastly, note how Pike speaks of Lucifer's splendorous light blinding feeble, sensual, or selfish souls. But being feeble-minded, sensual, or selfish are all negative qualities of evil men. So Lucifer only blinds the wicked, not the righteous or good people of the world? Why would that be if Pike is thinking of him in the traditional sense as being a villain? Because you don't blind people on your own team, obviously. No, Pike is actually saying this because he thinks of Lucifer in a positive sense and sees him as the guardian of occult enlightenment. And this is all coming out of a book where Pike himself has argued several times now that keeping the hidden knowledge of the occult from the ignorant masses is a good and upright thing to do. And he obviously does this as a justification for why Masonry conducts secret rituals and confers hidden knowledge on its members. So here, though, in our passage, Pike portrays Lucifer as doing the very same thing that Masonry itself does. That is, he keeps the wicked, feeble-minded masses from attaining the light, with a capital L, mind you, which we know from elsewhere in Morals and Dogma that Pike is all for. Take, for example, these quotes on the screen, and especially pages 77 and 78, where Pike says Masonry misleads people intentionally away from the truth, which it calls light, capital L, and claims that truth is not for those who are unworthy of it. And so again, we can see that Pike says Masonry does exactly what he says Lucifer does. And so concealing and blinding the unworthy from the truth like Lucifer does here is a noble thing in Pike's mind. And so we shouldn't read these words about Lucifer here and think of them as condemnatory. And so I think that right there is enough, and that's actually case closed on that one. But you know what? Masons will appeal to the previous sentence of this quotation for Morals and Dogma and pretend that just changes everything, even though we clearly showed that what Pike said here cannot be taken as him speaking negatively about Lucifer. And I mean, we don't have to quote every single thing Pike says about Lucifer to prove our point. We could still make our point that Pike praises Lucifer, even if in other places, or even in the prior sentence, he does the opposite. Because we're technically not responsible if Pike is contradictory in his statements about Lucifer throughout the book. I mean, I think Pike is guilty at times of being contradictory throughout Morals and Dogma, since he wants to associate himself with Christianity and Christ, and yet, in essence, he denies that by speaking positively and intermixing beliefs about ancient pagan religions and heresies like Gnosticism and Kabbalah. And so, we don't have to account for why Pike seemingly says the opposite of his opinion elsewhere to be able to correctly interpret his words in the initial quote that I gave, right? All we have to do is correctly interpret his words here to show that he does in fact praise Lucifer, and then that's game over. But all that said, let's go ahead and address this previous sentence to leave absolutely no wiggle room for Masonic apologists. And so the first problem here is that these individuals will act like the sentence is Pike giving the reader his opinion on Lucifer. Because they'll say something like, it's rather hard to despise Lucifer in one sentence, and yet praise him in the next. And so they obviously take Pike here to be saying something like, I despise Lucifer. But that's a total abuse of the text. It plainly does not say that. He says the apocalypse, which is what Catholics call the book of Revelation from the Bible, is to the grand pontiffs of the 19th degree such and such a thing. And so he very clearly does not say that this is so with him, as it's so often made out to be. No, it absolutely and emphatically does not say that. Rather, he's clearly saying this is the view of others, or even the Bible here. And even further than that, if you wanted to say something like, well, he's saying it's the belief of these 19th degree Masons he's talking about, so of course he agrees since he's also a fellow Mason. But the problem with that kind of argument is that we already know from the other quotations I showed from this exact same book that Pike speaks plainly about the many false interpretations that are fed to lower ranking Masons like this. So just because he says the grand pontiffs of the 19th degree take something to be one way does not mean he himself views it in that way. And that all goes double when he refers to the Bible as viewing something in a particular way, which is actually his main point in this sentence. Just because the sublime faith of Christianity, remembering that Pike has many nice things to say about Christianity, but denies it in principle, but just because Christianity despises Lucifer and looks to God alone, does not mean that Pike subscribes to that notion. Since in the very next sentence, he makes an argument against the biblical teaching that Lucifer is a being of darkness. And actually, even here in this sentence, Pike also speaks positively about Lucifer, because Pike says that these other sources outside himself despise the pomp of Lucifer. Pomp means magnificence, and it's a synonym of the very splendor Pike in the next sentence will apply to the light of Masonry that Lucifer himself bears. And so again, same argument as before here, you don't speak of someone being splendorous or magnificent if you think they're evil and malevolent. And notice he also says that they despise the works of Lucifer, which works is a word that's elusive of good works, never bad ones. For example, when people say you're not saved by works, they don't mean you're not saved by evil works. No one would think that. We all take for granted that when someone says that, they mean good deeds and not evil ones. No, to evoke the idea of evil deeds, he'd have to say more than just works, because works universally conveys the idea of good works, not one or the other, just arbitrarily take your pick. And so Pike pretty clearly seems to be saying that these 19th degree Masons despise the magnificence and good deeds of Lucifer. And again, it's clear here that he's not attributing this view to himself, but to others. It's not till the next sentence that he clearly explains his own view of the matter. But the final nail in the coffin when it comes to whether this quote from Pike is truly Luciferian or not is the little-known fact that most of this whole quotation is lifted, without citation mind you, from the writings of a very well-known Luciferian, Eliphas Levi. And if you don't recognize the name, you'll probably at least recognize his art. And that's right, he's the originator of this infamous depiction of Baphomet. And so this is who Pike is drawing his understanding of Lucifer from in Morals and Dogma, a well-known occultist and dark magician. And Eliphas Levi actually lived contemporarily with Pike, though Pike outlived him by nearly 2 decades. But Levi openly spoke positively about Lucifer and even Satan, as you can see from the quote on the screen. And what's more is we know for sure now that the point Pike was trying to make by pointing to the title Lightbearer was that it has to mean Lucifer can't be a being of darkness and evil. Because that's exactly what Levi, who Pike gets the quote from, was making a point about. And he even goes on to further explain at a later point in the same book that Pike got his quote from. Because he says, can the name Lightbearer be applied justly to an angel of trespass and darkness? We think not. More especially if it be understood as we understand who have the magical tradition behind us. And obviously Pike wouldn't quote Levi's words as his own, notice the lack of quotation marks, if he didn't share his opinion of the matter. And notice too the slight difference where Pike altered Levi's use of the word light to a capital L, proving it's not mere coincidence that Pike did that, but that this change has meaning to Pike in this book where he speaks often of the capital L light of Masonry. And so I think there's no doubt left that Pike is definitely promoting a Luciferian viewpoint in this quotation, which again gives added credibility to the text of the Taxil hoax because what was said in that quote is clearly consistent with Pike's view here. But most importantly, now you actually have the tools to respond to anyone that's arguing Pike's statement in Morals and Dogma is just a passing negative mention of Lucifer. No, it's not. So, if that happens to you, just point out the clear meaning of the text and its source, Eliphas Levi, the magician and Luciferian. And definitely pray for those caught up in Masonry because, as I showed in Morals and Dogma, they take pride in the fact that they mislead their own members and keep secrets from them. I mean, remember, the 32nd degree of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry is called the Sublime Prince of the Royal Secret. So obviously Masons lower than that shouldn't presume to think they're in the know on what that secret is, or plenty of others I would assume. Or else why call the degree that, if everyone else already knows the royal secret too? But in opposition to what Pike said, Christ actually taught that you're not to keep secret doctrines like that. No, he said that everything that he taught, you're to proclaim it loudly to the whole world, not keep it secret or start some kind of elitist group where you only pass on doctrine to those who've earned a high enough rank. No, in true biblical Christianity, the absolute most important truth of all time, the gospel, is taught right up front, for free. No having to earn it through climbing a ladder of ranks, and it's never kept some big secret only for the highest members in the church. No, Jesus said go and proclaim it to the whole creation. He didn't say hide the light from the unworthy like Pike taught. He said the opposite of that. He said don't hide it like a lamp under a basket, but instead put it on a stand so everyone can see it, not hidden away just for the adepts and sages like Pike wanted. The message that Christ died to save sinners, that he spilt his precious blood so that whoever believes in him can have the forgiveness of their sins, is not meant to be kept secret. The New Testament actually condemns not sharing this truth. Because people need to know that if they turn from their life of sin and come to Christ and trust in him for their salvation, God will lay on Jesus all their sins, past, present, and future, so that they'll be as clean and pure as fresh snow in God's eyes. Because it's an exchange, the great exchange. Because Christ takes your sins onto himself and is punished with the punishment you deserved from God, while you take onto yourself all the goodness and perfect obedience that Christ lived out in his life. And God in turn blesses you with the reward that only Jesus ever deserved. That is eternal fellowship with God and being seated at his right hand in the heavenly places, rejoicing in him forever and ever. The whole world needs to hear this message. It's not just for the leadership in the church or some special group of intellectual people like Albert Pike and his Masonic pals. No, Jesus charged us to tell it to the whole world. And so I hope this video was a blessing to you, and I want to thank you guys for tuning in. And if you want to know much more about the gospel so you can be prepared to take it into all the world and be able to explain it with clarity, I'd highly recommend my second gospel video, because it goes into great detail on the subject, and I'm sure if you'll take the time to watch it, that it'll be a huge blessing to you. And I just want to say thank you to all of you who are liking and subscribing and sharing my videos around. I really appreciate it, and it means a lot, guys. And if you want more from me more often, you can check out my Christian Video Vault channel here on YouTube. And with that, thanks again for tuning in. I love you all, and Godspeed.